these three revolutions, at the end of the day, you can see that we were moving into a newer kind of a society, and the society that we are talking about, it was more or less different from the previous society, because it witnessed massive transformation massive transformation in terms of, when I'm talking about economic modernity, the basic mode of production, the way you are relating with the kind of labor relations we had, the way we produced, everything underwent a dramatic change. And at the same time, when I talk about political modernity, we have these ideals of French Revolution that talks about freedom, liberty, uh, democracy, the values that you know gave you a kind of a political modernity. And when I see that what are the takeaways from enlightenment, you know the basic idea behind enlightenment was, it forced you to believe in human reason, trying to challenge all kinds of authority, be it any kind of a political authority in terms of a tribal head, or a caste authority, a family authority, any kind of a spiritual authority. The belief that as a free thinking adult, you have every right to take your own decisions, to think properly, and you may not be guided by traditions. That was how a modern way of looking at things evolved. So you know you might be wondering, why do I need to talk about emergence of sociology in a research methodology class? The reason being that I'm talking about emergence of a new kind of a society, that is a modern society, and the existing discipline, they were not well equipped to understand this particular society that had emerged with the advent of modernity. So what I'm trying to say is, you have a fast moving society, a society that is marked with industrial revolution, where you not only need an international market for your products, but also you need a market where you can procure your raw materials. So that was something which was triggering the very idea of colonialism. You have this idea of sea voyages, people going and moving into different places, and they rediscover the world. So for the first time, you are moving out of your comfort zone, the idea of mobility being associated with it. So when I say mobility, in some sense we are opening up our society. you know it was a time when, maybe as an individual in my village, I never dared to you know go beyond, say, the limits of my village, or if I could see a mountain at the horizon, I always harbored this feeling that perhaps the world ended with that mountain. So science had a role to play, in encouraging these voyages. Because when I talk about these three revolutions, for example, Enlightenment especially, it was actually preceded by your scientific and commercial revolution. So, for example, Newton's law of gravity, that gave human beings the confidence that you can go ahead, you can go beyond your limits, and you will not fall down. Because we always thought that, okay, if I travel and if I reach the brink of the world, perhaps I will topple over. So that was something, giving you this idea that no, earth is spherical, there is a force of gravity that is holding you back, so you will never fall down. So that gave some kind of courage to these human beings to travel, to take up these voyages. So basically, you have certain scientific revolutions which actually, facilitated a kind of a commercial revolution. So when I'm talking about scientific revolution, there was this very idea of developing a scientific temper in my everyday life. The idea of applying rationality in my day-to-day affairs. The idea of planning things, the way I need to plan things so that I can make my life better. So what I'm trying to say is that you, as a member of a society, you see some transformations taking place because of these three revolutions. For example, I would say that the pre-modern society used to be a closed kind of a society. you know a closed kind of a society in the sense that more or less they would remain same if you look at them, say, after 5 years or 10 years. But in these kind of societies, you know you have things growing and moving very fast. You see strange people coming into your setup, people migrating from your own setup. I see white Europeans coming into my setup as colonial rulers. So basically I am dealing with someone who is not like me, and at the same time, I see these fast changing structures around me. So that was a basic need for us to understand that you know how do I study the society around me. If you remember, we had disciplines like anthropology, political science, which pre existed our own existence. They have always been there. But if you ask what was the need for yet another social science like sociology, the reason being that perhaps we had entered a new kind of a society with the emergence of modern society, and the existing social sciences were not well equipped to study them. So there was a methodological need that we need to address here. So when I talk about a methodological need, uh, we have to see that one of the major inspiration for all social sciences was natural sciences. If you look at your classical thinkers, some of your classical thinkers like, say, Auguste Comte, or say Spencer, they were trying to celebrate the idea of science, because trying to make sociology as scientific as possible as a discipline. So, what I'm trying to say, the post enlightenment phase, it not only enthused a scientific temper in you and applying the idea of science in your everyday life, but we were also trying to look for a robust methodology for understanding the society around us. And that's how we felt the need for a new kind of a discipline with a new methodology, a methodology that could grasp these changing structures, that could be open to these new kind of people and experiences that I was encountering. So when I'm talking about methodology, as I told you, we were heavily depending on natural sciences. So natural, we were trying to ape all the methods, the perspectives, so that we can claim that sociology is a science, and it is much more scientific than people think it to be. That was first thing. To make the discipline scientific, we started methodologically reorienting the discipline, shaping the discipline so that a claim for scientific status could be made. And one of the perspectives that we adopted to make it scientific was the idea of positivism. Are you aware of what positivism is? Please let me know, because it's very important for me to know that, so that I will, shape my lecture accordingly. Yes, any one of you. Whatever you are aware of, you can just let me know. Or if you think no, you're it's a completely new thing for you, you can also say so. No? Yes or no? Just you can write in the chat box at least. Well, absolutely no response. This is very unmotivating. Okay, so I should believe that you know about it. No. Okay. Uh, you have read August Comte. At least you have heard his name. Comte is talking about, a positive society, a society that is more scientifically oriented. So basically, when I'm talking about positivism, it is actually a perspective, a worldview, where we tend to, you know see everything from a quantitative perspective. The use of quantitative data, the use of, you can say, the that was as I said, that there was a massive influence of natural sciences on social science, and we are trying to make it as scientific as possible. So the basic reason here is that when we tend to pick up a discipline and its methodology, and we are trying to claim its scientific status, we were trying to, imitate the methods and perspectives of natural sciences as well. Okay, so that was one part of it. So for, the initial years, when you talk about the initial years of this discipline, and we were when we're trying to claim its scientific status, we were simply taking up the methods that a natural scientist would be using. Just a minute, I have some internet issues. Yeah. Well, so yes, so the basic difference between these orientations as far as physical and social sciences are concerned, that you will see that physical sciences believe in one absolute truth. That's what positivists also believe in, that there has to be an absolute truth that needs to be discovered. Uh, So, for a very long period of time, as sociologists, we were looking at things methodologically that was posited from a positivist perspective. So, what positivism is about? You will see that in the 19th century, positivists conceived knowledge about reality as information which could be empirically proven. So, how it could be empirically proven? All those kind of knowledge, normally, when do we consider a phenomena? When we are able to perceive it through our sense organs, five sense organs. So unless we do that, we cannot prove that something has been empirically witnessed. So basically, here you would see that the aim of science was to produce knowledge for improving its surrounding. So this conception of science somehow became an ideology, because why do you need science? Science is not just meant for for its craving for knowledge. It has an ideology of doing good to mankind or humankind, to be more generic, and to improve its surrounding. So somewhere, natural sciences, they had this feeling of dominance, that they attempted to subdue nature, because mostly we started using resources so that we could create a new civilization. And the more scientifically advanced you are, the more able to you are able to exploit resources. So in some way, we were not only using, but we were misusing resources in the name of science. So knowledge allows human to control the rest of the world. So the way we started using knowledge, the ideology was, whoever has knowledge would be more powerful. So with that, you can uh, dominate the rest of the world. So social science premised that humans must be known, used, controlled like other things. So how do you, if you remember, you might have come across this term called objectivity. Objectivity is something that as scientists, as researchers, we all need to maintain. So basically, etymologically, this word comes from, or you can say, the term object. That means you are treating every society or every community or a human group that you are trying to study as a thing. I'm taking them as an object. So basically, what do scientists do? What do natural scientists do? They deal with inanimate objects, isn't it? So you have all liberty to treat an inanimate object in any way possible. So, we don't have those ethical concerns when we are dealing with inanimate object, you know. But when you take another human being to be an object of research, there lies the problem. That perhaps, it was not within the scope of positivism. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that, you know, in social science, when we study human beings, we tend to take human beings as a thing, thingified humans. As science, you know, deals with all kinds of inanimate objects and things, we tend to deal with human beings in that way. So basically, this kind of a perspective became unacceptable, because that is not how, that was not the correct approach to deal with a fellow human being. And when you say that, you are trying to study another human being, you are putting yourself in a place of hierarchy. where somebody is the item, the object to be studied, and you are somebody who is out there to know them. You are the knower, they are the known. That creates a kind of an hierarchy. So what happens in this trend, we tend to examine the outcomes through experiments. So for positivist, knowledge is all about careful observation, measurement of reality, and what exists out there. So we have to just understand what exists out there, and that's the reason positivism, had this tendency of treating everything like a thing, because you just need to discover it is hidden somewhere. The truth remains hidden. You just need to find it out, and that's how you become a researcher. So that is how we talk about the idea of absolute truth, that truth is one, because the kind of science that you pursue, that believes in one particular kind of a truth, and it is hidden somewhere, it is hidden out there. You need to find it out, you need to measure it, you need to observe it. So basically we started adopting those practices for understanding human societies. So basically, in positivist position, we are trying to take up, or rather discover certain invariable laws, universal laws. Then we tend to believe in objectivity, that I have already told. Maybe I'll take up a class on objectivity itself, because objectivity was something where, as natural or social scientists, we needed to take it as a thumb rule. And as I said, that taking every object of study as a thing, that means you are distanciating yourself from that object of study. You are not having any kind of emotional or any kind of attachment with it. So the way you are studying an inanimate object, you are doing the same for human societies. Then another important aspect of objectivity is the idea of value neutrality. They do go hand in hand. Maybe I will be dealing with objectivity and value neutrality in more detail as we proceed through the class. The other thing is the idea of measurability. When we say that we are looking at studying things from a positivist position, we are in a position to measure them, to accurately measure them, even if it's an event, an phenomena, object, whatever it is. You have to have the ability to measure it. Then the next point is causality, trying to learn the reason behind that event or phenomena, whatever it is. Generalization, to see if it can be applicable to other parts of the world, to other societies. The more generalized it can be made. And then replication. If the same kind of a study could be replicated, if you can, produce it again and again. Normally we talk about, reliability. I'll be talking about it as we proceed through the classes. So what I'm trying to say, that these are the basic characteristics when we talk about positivism or a positivist position. And this is a kind of a position where you take the help of statistical tools. You can see the rise of a mathematical cult here. You tend to see in terms of quantitative numbers, and you understand things in that way. So that was one position that became extremely popular when we were talking about natural sciences and social sciences as well, because in 19th century the way for doing sociology was mostly depending on this positivist position, which was heavily borrowed from natural sciences. Then there is another position that we tend to talk about, that is constructivism. It is believed that individuals or communities hold certain subjective meaning towards the world, isn't it? You know, Max Weber had said that when it comes to the choice of your research topic, also, that is also subjectively inclined. Why do we take up a particular topic for research? Because we perhaps have certain kind of prior experience associated with that. So when that itself is has a subjective orientation, it is very difficult to maintain objectivity when it comes to human societies and human communities, because we cannot, and we, to some extent, we should not treat them as objects when we are tending to study them. And most important, what these constructivists believe, they are also called anti-positivist, because they do not believe with the very perspective and the positions that the positivists have taken. They believe that finding the truth is not important, because there can be multiple truths. Every community has its own way of looking at truth and understanding and perceiving the world. So that doesn't make one thing more truthful and other less truthful. Uh, there are certain things which depends on human experience. I'll give you an example. For example, you see that mm, suppose you are walking in the dark street, and you just jump over a piece of rope, and for a few fraction of seconds you tend to believe that it is a snake. So now tell me, the kind of experience you have, you will scream, or you'll almost have your heart in your mouth. You will you, you you will imagine that perhaps it is the last day of your life, you are almost dead. So, and soon after you realize that, oh my god, it was not a snake, it was just a piece of rope. Now tell me, the very fact that it was not a snake, that it was a snake rather, has been falsified. Okay, it is not a snake, it is a piece of rope. But the experience that under you have undergone for those minutes, was it false? Can you say that no, that experience was completely false? It's difficult, because had you encountered a real snake, you'd have the same kind of a feeling. You know, had it not been a piece of rope, and had it been a real snake, the intensity with which I screamed, the kind of fear that I had for those moments, it would have been the same, isn't it? Yes or no? So basically, these constructivists, they try to say that you know the most important thing that positivism is missing out on is the idea of experience. You are experiencing something, and yet we do not talk about human experience, because positivism made you too very stringent, in the sense that what research topics need to be taken up, so that a scientific claim could be made. So we did not take up all those things that was associated with certain kind of subjectivity, with the fear that it will make things less scientific. So when it comes to human experience, human feelings, emotions, or you say the idea of faith, the idea of you know imagination, we started avoiding all those things. We only, started picking up things which could be measured so that we can claim our scientific status. So, isn't it an absurd thing that as human beings, you tend to, engage in things which are mechanical, and you don't identify or pick up those things for study which constitutes the very humane things in a human being. How do you make a human being without human experience? So that was basically something which was missing out in positivism. So we started saying that meanings are constructed by human beings as they engage with the world they are interpreting. Meaning is bestowed by culture of a given society. So one must understand the context and the setting. So to understand something, you cannot just look at things from its face value. You have to understand, the entire context. You have to derive the meaning from the context. I'll give you an example. Uh, have you heard of this Niyamgiri movement? You might have read about it in the newspaper or somewhere. So basically, what is it about? There is this Niyamgiri hill which is rich in bauxite, and once upon a time, the Odisha state of Odisha uh, wanted to mine out bauxite, so it wanted to lease it out to an multinational company so that mining and excavation works could be done. But these tribal people of Niyamgiri, they believe that it is the seat of their god, the Niyam Penu, that is their god. He sits on those mountains, and they felt that they cannot disturb their god. So, from a positivist position, the way I am looking at things as an observer, as an outsider observer, I will tend to see things in a different light. I might say that, how foolish of them. The government is giving them so much of compensation amount. They're giving them jobs, they're giving them a housing colony. What more do they need? Why don't they just leave those resources for the state so that they can mine out bauxite, and we can have a good revenue generated, a state revenue. We can create jobs, we can invite MNCs. Our economy is going to bloom because of it. Now let's see things from the perspective of the tribes of Niyamgiri. If you ask any one of them, if you I remember one of the interviews of a elderly lady from the community who said that, I don't need money in cash, I don't need a job. I would Okay, I can leave this place provided you give me a new jungle, because I don't need money, I don't need job, I don't need all those kind of consumption goods. And if you look into their households, they hardly have any commodities. Their life is so very intimate with nature, that they take almost everything from nature. They don't need money in any way. They don't need to buy anything from the market, and they have a different kind of a setup. So if you see things from a middle class educated perspective, the kind of backgrounds that maybe you come from, you would have the feeling that, okay, perhaps these are stupid people. Government is giving them so much of money, they are not able to take that, they do not, and they what do? They want to stay in this jungle and look at their idea of future. They don't even think of the future generation. For the next upcoming generations, they will be rotting in this forest. What kind of future they are having? This is how we think of it. Now, if you ask them about our lives, they will say that okay, maybe you are having a comfortable life in the cities with all kinds of electrical amenities, with all kinds of comfort. You earn so much, then you know because of your consumption, the pollution level has gone up. There is climate change. You end up in hospitals. No doubt you earn lakhs of money, and only to spend that money in hospital. So at least I'm living a life in the jungle where I'm able to breathe in and breathe out pure air. I eat healthy. I don't eat pesticides affected food, and my longevity is much more than you. So who is leading a better life? So who is more developed? So why I'm telling you all these things, the reason being that when we talked about positivism vouched for one single absolute truth. So from a positivist perspective, and normally as a researcher, when you take up this positivist perspective, you see things as an onlooker, as an outside the object observer, who is just sitting, seeing things from the outside. But if you talk about the constructivists, the constructivist would see things from the perspective of the actor. So, for example, if you ask a positivist, the positivist, will not try to get into this entire thing. They will observe from outside, and they will try to give this kind of a notion that, these people, they are living in the forest and they are denied this much of revenue. It was stupid of them. The state could have got a revenue of generated a revenue of so much amount, but because of their stupidity this couldn't be done. You might have come with these kind of conclusions. But for a constructivist, as I told you, they don't believe in one single narrative. They believe in multiple truths. So what would be the truth of that community? How do these, they are nobody's stupid, each one of us, we tend to look for our own self interest. And you think it is the idea of education and the lifestyle that you are leading that will give you this sense of safeguarding your self interest? No, they are also aware of their own self interest. The kind of traditional knowledge they have, it is much more enriching. So it is just a matter that we live in two different social systems. If you live in, put them in our social system, it is difficult for them to survive. And that's the reason why we are talking about reservations for the marginalized community. Now if I ask you to spend some time in their social system, in that jungle, perhaps we might not be having the skill. So that's the reason a constructivist would say that there are multiple truths. Every community has its own perception of what truth is. So the basic purpose of a social scientist would be not to you know not to go hunting or chasing that absolute truth that lies hidden, and somehow you will come up with this thing that eureka, I have found it. No, that doesn't happen. For a constructivist, they would say that we are not really concerned about understanding or about finding out that absolute truth. We rather do not know what is truth or what is falsity, or we do not want to engage in that kind of a dialogue. But what is more important, that how do they make sense of the world? What is their perception of truth? Because you can simply shrug it off as saying that hey, That's a superstition. They believe that their god resides in this will, in those hills, the Niyam Raja. That's the reason why they call them the Niyam Raja. So it's such an absurd and superstitious feeling. It is not truth. It is something which falls in the realm of superstition. But it could be. I'm really not bothered about what is truth and what is false. What I am bothered about is how do they make sense of their idea of truth. That's what I want to see. So if you remember, few moments ago I was giving you the example of the snake. So I am really not concerned whether I have encountered a real snake or not, but that experience of seeing that piece of rope and mistaking it as a snake, it was as authentic as perhaps my experience of encountering a real snake would have been. So basically, I'm not engaging myself with falsity or truthfulness that positivists do. I am just trying to look at the authenticity of human experience, how people make sense of the world, how they experience that truth. For them, what is truth? That truth could be a piece of falsity in my eyes, but what makes them feel that it is true? How they perceive that idea of the world and their understanding of that truth. So that's how meanings are constructed by human beings as they engage with the world they're interpreting. It is about how they interpret the world, understanding their interpretation of the world rather than going for a lookout for that absolute truth that natural scientists do. No, there is nothing called one particular single absolute truth. The world is based on multiple truths. Even natural sciences, they have also started adopting that kind of position. That's the reason, take for example something like quantum mechanics. They believe that you know light is a wave and light is a particle as well, the duality of matter. So the idea of dualism exist in human societies, in understanding human societies, that we cannot deny. And the idea of meaning that you are talking about, it has been given to us by culture, and one must understand the context and the setting. In order to understand a meaning of a particular thing, we have to understand the context from which that meaning has emerged. We cannot fix a meaning as something which is absolute. The idea of that thing, the meaning of certain things would keep changing over the years depending on the context from which it has emerged. So that's how we tend to engage with reality and societies. So, meaning is an outcome of social interaction. The basic question the researcher needs to ask is how to make sense of reality rather than asking how to find reality. How do you make sense of that reality that you once understood it to be? Then, at the same time, you have certain other positions as well. Because when you are talking about social sciences, just understanding or knowing the society is not enough. We have to think in terms of certain changes that we intend to make in a society. Okay, uh, let's just take a 10 minutes break, and I will take up the other positions that is available in social sciences. So now the time is 7:25. Maybe we can meet by 7:35. Welcome back. So we'll continue with the slide. So basically, I was talking to you about the different worldviews that we tend to, you know, share when it comes to looking at or understanding social reality. So apart from positivism and constructivism, you have this advocacy or participatory claims. This position actually emerged during the 1980s and 90s when it was felt that they did not, the kind of research that we are doing, it doesn't bring any change in the marginalized sections of the society. So basically, this position addresses the issue of social justice. It always has an action agenda, and researcher always feel that it is intertwined with a political agenda. So, what matters here is the voice of the participant, and it is taken as one united voice. It is a process of inquiry with the other rather than on the other. So, the basic difference that how it stands out from a positivist position is that you are trying to give voice to the other. You are not trying to replace your voice with the voice of the other. You do not tend to hierarchize between yourself as the knower and the known, which makes the object of your study. So basically, you entertain them to participate in the entire process. You tend to, hold their voice. You tend to address the idea of justice, that is as justice from their point of view, not from your point of view. That's the basic difference between, you know, positivist and the advocacy position. Then after that, you have the pragmatic knowledge claim. When you talk about pragmatism, it doesn't show allegiance to one single worldview or method. It applies mixed methods. Individual researchers are free to choose their problem. Truth is what works at the time. One chooses this approach looking into the political, economic, and social context. So they simply apply this kind of a worldview so that they can change the lives of the people they are trying to study, the communities you are trying to understand. So to start off with, as I told you, the two most important, basic important dominant positions in social science as well as sociological studies has been positivism and the anti-positivist or the constructivist stance. So it started out with the need for understanding the other, in contrast to qualitative research that is based on, sorry, it is quantitative research that is based on positivistic paradigm. Because, as I told you earlier, positivism, you do not take into account the experience of the people. You tend to see things from the position of an outsider as an observer, and a nonchalant observer who is not indulged or engaged in the everyday lives of the people. You're just observing things from a distance, and that's how you take things into consideration. But in an anti-positivist position, that is the constructivist position that engages mostly qualitative studies. And remember, when I'm talking about the positivist position, you are taking into account quantitative studies, mostly the quantitative methods of research. So when I talk about this qualitative position, you tend to see that you know you are trying to look at things from the actor's point of view, the participant who is out there in the field. You try to be them, you step into their shoes. And the beauty of this perspective is that you completely blur the boundaries between the knower and the known. You tend to be them. You cry along with them. You tend to take up their worries, their issues and problems as your own. That's how you completely step into their shoes. You remember Weber has this concept of intersubjectivity. That is this position, stepping into somebody else's shoes means using my subjectivity to understand your subjectivity. you know I will just try to look at your face and say that, oh my god, you look sad today. What would have happened? Maybe you had this kind of an incident prior earlier this morning, or you had this issue with you. This could be the reason. So I'm contemplating, I'm trying to be in your position, keep myself in your position, and then understand you. And then, the positivist position is like, seeing you as an outsider. If you know, there are two English terms, sympathy and empathy. What is the basic difference between sympathy and empathy? Anyone who can answer that? You can just unmute yourself and speak up. You can speak in Odia or Hindi or English.
I mean,
Anyone?
empathy we put.
Yeah,
I mean, empathy we put ourselves in their point of view, in their
very,
place.
very good. Very good. And sympathy is like, just trying to look at things from an outside. Oh, poor baby, you had this thing. Acha, 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 empty he gala. Oh, trying to be an outsider, see things from an outsider. But when I be in your position, I tend to, take up your problems as my problem. I try with you. That is empathy. So basically, the constructivist or that anti-positivist position is that of empathy. You're stepping into their shoes, or in Weberian term we call it intersubjectivity. I try to use my subjectivity to understand your subjectivity. So positivist position is like that of an empathetic person. You're just outside the setting and you're just observing. You're just a distant observer. But the constructivist or the anti-positivist position is like you are one of the actors. You try to put yourself in the position of that actor. Okay. So these two positions actually dominated the world of methodology when we talk about perspective. Because whenever you talk about, you might have read about different methods, observation as a method, sub survey as a method. We'll be reading that, case study method, blah blah, whatever it is. But the thing is that we have to locate all these methods within certain worldviews. So when I pick up a research problem, I have to choose either ways. Ki, how do I do it? What worldview do I need to take it up? I have to, see things from a positivist position, or from an anti-positivist or a constructivist position. Say, for example, I will say that, okay, today we are witnessing massive migration. So let me take up a study on migration. So basically, what do I want to study about these migrants? Am I trying to look into the trends of migration, where migration, what is the gender dynamics of migration, who migrate more, it is the male or the female, it is the man or the woman, or do they migrate to the countryside or the urban areas more, or they migrate to the other states or outside the country more? Maybe I'm trying to look at this trend as an outsider. Maybe I can take up a positivist position where I can take up certain surveys. Or if my idea of study is about migration, but I want to encounter that feeling of being a migrant when you are away from home, you are in a new separate setting where the environment is not very supportive, people are around you are hostile. How do you survive? How do you manage? It is not just a matter of economy. It is, it is your feeling as a human being who is away from his or her own setting. So what do I do then? then I have to take up a position because I tend to understand how do they make sense of that social reality around them. So I have to take up a constructivist position, and accordingly I will choose my methods, I will choose my tools of research. Okay, so you know, these are the two dominant positions in research methodology, which talks about the worldviews that we need to choose whenever we lay our hands on any research problem. So it started studying people in their natural settings and attempted to interpret it in terms of meaning people did not put them. So whenever you are talking about qualitative studies and in this anti-positivist position, you do it mostly in their natural setting. And one of the most famous methods of doing that is ethnographic studies that started in the 17th century. And ethnography as a method, it has been borrowed from disciplines like anthropology, which was much ancient than ours. So you know, you might have read about the Trobriand Islanders, or you might have read about Margaret Mead studies. They were, you know, very famous anthropologists. So mostly, you know, the so-called early social anthropologists, be it Ratcliffe Brown, be it Malinowski, this is how they all started, you know, with taking up ethnography. Uh, Prominently in the 19th and 20th century, amidst various disciplines like cultural studies, cultural anthropology, interpretive sociology, you have these diverse orientation where we started using, you know, this anti-positivist position. One another thing that I would want you to understand is the idea of thinking sociologically. You know, when we talk about research, when we talk about research methodology, it's very important to see things as a sociologist. And how do we do that? I mean, the basic difference between, say, sociologist and psychologist, or say anthropologist or political scientist, because all are in some way or the other, they are trying to understand the society. So what kind of, you know, qualitative difference you are adding because of your disciplinary specialization. So one of the important ways of knowing that is the idea of sociological imagination. You must be acquainted with it. This was one of the most famous books that was written by C. Wright Mills, and that was, I if I'm not mistaken, that was the second most popular book as rated by American Sociological Association after Weber's Economy and Society. That is the second most you know, best selling and highest referred and most noted book. So sociological imagination, it actually, you know, it came at a point when positivism was at its height. Because you know, if you look at this work, whenever you get time, you know, I would request each one of you to go through this book, because that will give you the essence of this discipline, as to what sociology is all about, and how as sociologists you need to think differently from others. So basically, you know, this book says that you know, as sociologists, you all have made a promise in the sense that you are the children of these revolutions. And most importantly, when we talk about enlightenment, with enlightenment you came up with certain promises. Because what did enlightenment give you? Enlightenment told you that, you know, all human beings, they need to be free. Freedom is essential to us. We are all equal. And that of course was triggered by scientific studies, because your natural sciences said that, for example, you know, the human anatomy remains the same. It doesn't matter whether you are white skinned or black skinned or brown skinned. you have this many number of bones, the blood groups are only 4 or 5. It really doesn't matter. So basically you are talking about the idea of every human being equal, irrespective of the cultural background they come from. It really doesn't matter. So the very this very temper has been inspired by scientific disciplines. Okay. So what I'm trying to say that when we talk about enlightenment and this post enlightenment phase, we as a discipline we believe that as human beings we are equal. We need to be tolerant to each other, because it was only within the modern context that when you started arriving at different places because of these sea voyages, the phase of colonialism and everything, where you started encountering the other is somebody who is not like you, somebody who doesn't look like me, somebody whose cultural practices are different from me, who eats different kind of food, who practices a different kind of a religion. So how open I could be to accept that other in my own setting, so that I can develop a certain kind of a tolerance for that other. So basically what I'm trying to say you that enlightenment gave you a promise that sociologist and sociology as a discipline comes with certain values, the values of maintaining freedom, of treating people equally, the values of democracy. And it is very interesting to learn that you will see that in only in those societies where democracy has prevailed, sociology as a discipline has its own growth. In dictatorial states, sociology as a discipline could never survive properly. There is a very intimate relationship between sociology, democracy, freedom. You live with these values. You have a promise, the post enlightenment promise of preserving these values. Secularism, these are all characteristics of a modern society, because in a modern setup, when you are living amidst others, people who are not like you tend to be secular, where you don't think in terms of looking for believers and non-believers. No, you tend to tolerate each other's practices. So what I'm trying to tell here is that C. Wright Mills says that you know you made a promise of maintaining freedom, the promise of uh, promise of making democracy available to us as citizens. So by the 50s, just give me a moment. Yeah, what I'm trying to say is that C. Wright Mills is saying that by the 50s and the 60s, American society was doing very good in terms of you know in being an industrialized city. And there was this kind of research that was booming in American society, mostly what you say today in today's term, consumer research. So sociologists were hired for doing these surveys regarding what kind of products people like to use, what is their taste, why do they use this kind of a thing. So you know those in those days the newspaper used to be replete with so-called surveys reports. You might have seen in Times of India. I don't know it appears now or not these days. In earlier times they used to give a question like Do you think this particular party will come to power? Yes or no? So the next day, the result would say that 60% said yes and 40% said no. So C. Wright Mill is actually questioning that. It is not really important to understand why 60% said yes or 40% said no. But the thing is that who this 60% is and who this 40% are. We really don't have any data on these people. They are like nameless, headless people. You don't have any idea on their demographic, socio-economic profiles. And yet, we say that, so many people have said yes or so many people have said no. You have to understand the reason, and in order to know the reason, you have to understand who these people are. So these surveys are senseless in the sense it makes no sense, because they do not take into account, or as a researcher you don't have a curiosity to know who these people are, and why, if at all these people are so and so, why did they make this kind of a choice. So basically, in some way, by the 50s, sociologists were losing their the kind of, what I say, the promise they made during the time of the Enlightenment, their dedication to the values of democracy and freedom. So, what you are doing at the end of the day, picking up surveys for your clients and or your corporates, some company. So basically, you as a sociologist, you have a bigger responsibility. You are not just responsible to your employer, who is just a corporate or a client. You have a bigger responsibility towards the society. So it reminds you of that position, of that responsibility, and that's how it somehow develops a criticism towards the positivist position, saying that it spreads a kind of a mindless, headless kind of a, what you say, research, which leads nowhere, because you don't have the curiosity to understand who these people are, who they are, who are you talking about, where do they hail from, and at the same time, you have forgotten your promise, the values of democracy and freedom, that is of utmost value to a sociologist. And the other part of the book says sociological imagination is about how to think away from the routines of your everyday life. For example, I will give you an example here. Suppose I will say that, okay, I lost my near and dear ones during the COVID. It was a painful experience for me, but it was not it was not just me who was going through that kind of a pain. The entire world was going through that kind of a pain. People across the globe were losing their near and dear ones. So this is how you juxtapose what he says, personal troubles in a social milieu. For example, the problem of unemployment. The unemployment is not just unique to me. I would see that, okay, I have my own personal narrative associated with unemployment, because I don't have a job. I am not able to do this. You can create a Bollywood story out of my helplessness and vulnerability for lack of a job. But just look at the milieu of that time. That was the time when the globe was undergoing recession. There was global recession, there was this kind of a thing. And this is how you locate yourself, and that is how you detach yourself from your personal problems, and you tend to see things from an aerial view, from a global perspective. So basically, it is trying to say that you have to juxtapose history with biography. You know, I would tend to talk to you about my biography. about my life. But again, as I told you, it is always important as a sociologist, as per the ideas of C. Wright Mills, that you have to juxtapose that story, that problem of yours from a larger context. So your biography has to be juxtaposed with the history of those times. And as you know, we all are a product of our times, and there is a historical force acting upon us. For example, in my family, there are three generations of women: me, my mother, and my grandmother. We all belong to the same family. We have the same genetic orientation. We speak perhaps the same language. We eat the same food. We live in the same environment, isn't it? But don't you think that there is a difference between me and my grandmother or my mother? Even if we are posited in the same situation, there are different historical forces acting on us. If I say that, try to relate yourself to a grandmother, at times it becomes very difficult to communicate with them, isn't it? It's not just an issue with the language. Maybe the kind of Odia they speak or Hindi they speak, it would be different from your generation. The kind of anxieties they have, the kind of body language, the kind of what I say, the kind of exposure that you have, it would be different from there. The kind of anxiety you have, they will not understand. What they have, you will not understand. So why is it so? We live in the same house, we eat the same food. No, the situations are so very similar, the environment is so very similar. Why do we all differ? The reason being that we are product of our times. For example, my grandmother was, you'll see, she's no more right now. I would say that she was born in the 1930s. My mother was born in the 1950s. I was born in the late 80s or 90s. So we belong to different historical context. And if I make a comparison with me and your generation, perhaps you belong to this liberalized age, and maybe generation, what we say, the Gen Z. So today there is, so much talk about the Gen Z, because there is a different historical force acting on you. The kind of exposure you have with media, especially social media, we never had that. And the anxieties and the worries that we have, you never experienced that. We all are located even in the same society, even in the same house. We all are located in different historical positions. So there are different historical forces acting on us. So my story would be very different from my mother's and my grandmother's story, even if we share so many things. Got it? So basically, that's how he says that, the first thing is that you have to look into all the troubles of yourself, the troubles of the milieu and the public issues. They are part of the social structure, and you are just one amidst them. I might feel sorry for myself that, I had such a great loss because of say COVID, and this thing happened to me, this thing happened to my family. But at the end of the day, that was something that everybody was undergoing. So C. Wright Mills says that as a sociologist, you have to detach yourselves, distantiate yourself from your own problems and look at them as a bigger social problem, as a bigger social issue, which is very difficult in some sense or the other. And the other most important thing that Mills is talking about is, how do you tend to you know uh, think away from the routines, from the everyday routines. Here, if you remember, he has, if you have gone through Anthony Giddens' book, he starts with this very beautiful example of coffee. You know, a very cup of coffee. It has different meanings. The way constructivists would see it. What does a coffee actually mean? Coffee is a beverage that perhaps we need for kickstarting our day, or it's but its meaning is not just a beverage. When I ask somebody, a boy or a boy asks a girl out for a coffee, it has a larger social implication. You are asking somebody out on a date. So it's the idea is not just to have coffee. The idea is to create larger possibilities. It has a symbolic value. Then coffee again could be a drug because it stimulates your brain, but it is something which is socially acceptable. It is not unlike marijuana or alcohol. It is not a drug. They are also brain stimulating drugs, but we don't take coffee as that kind of a drug. Then, if you look at the very idea of socio-economic relationship, like how did the idea of look at the very idea of indentured labors. You know, think of the times when people or laborers who were illiterate, they were taken as bonded laborers to these faraway places where coffee was cultivated, because there was lack of labor in those countries. These coffee estates, which is a hallmark of these colonial times. So coffee is can be seen as a history of human misery, a history where the nostalgia of being away from home has been created. Because if you look at those times, these people, they were illiterate, and sometimes they were hijacked, sometimes they were given all kinds of false hopes that and they never had a sense of geography. They really did not know whether they are traveling to say Calcutta or the Caribbeans, what the globe was like. They never had a sense of geography. So it was based on this relationship of inequality. And today also, in this post in this colonial phase, when you look at this idea of coffee, how trade relationships between countries are being shaped because of a coffee economy. And at the same time, how globalization has created avenues for a new kind of a lifestyle that comes with a coffee. So coffee can have so many meanings. It's not just a cup of beverage. It has a it's a product. It's a product. Say something like somebody like Starbucks, which cost you 500 rupees for one cup. So how the idea of globalization has entrenched into our everyday life. So that is how C. Wright Mills is actually giving you an example with coffee, that how you need to think ourselves away from the familiar, from the routinized everyday lives. You all might be taking starting your day with a cup of coffee or with a cup of tea, but when you look into that cup, when you see that cup, you don't just as a sociologist, especially your role as a sociologist needs to be defined here. That cup is not just about you or your habit of having it as a beverage, or the kind of brand you like or dislike. It is about the social and human relationship that gets associated with that cup of coffee. How you tend to think yourselves away from the familiar milieu. You tend to, while sipping that coffee, you think of how it is, what is the situation of the laborer who is working in a coffee company. What are the miseries of that laborer? You think of, the idea of trade unionism associated in that kind of a corporate, or you think of that that indentured labor who has been taken away from some parts of India and who is now located in a Caribbean country because of the coffee trade, international coffee trade. Or you think of the very idea of consumerist culture being created with globalization, that you know that fascinates you, that makes a simple cup of coffee so very valuable that you are ready to pay 500 rupees for just one cup of coffee. So thinking away from the regular milieu, taking yourself far from your everyday life, and not engaging with your social problems the way you always do, because that's the basic difference between a layperson and a sociologist. So methodologically, when you look at a social problem, or even if you are you know trying to look at your own social problems, your own issues that you are suffering from, you have to again play the role of a sociologist with your own issues as well. It shouldn't bother you that if I don't get a job, what will happen to me. This is not the thing. As a sociologist, how you can see it? You can just see it yourself as one of those 100 millions who have been affected by the circumstances of their times. So it's not about personalizing everything. You might have heard your parents would be saying, you know I remember my grandfather, he used to say, the mathematics of our times was really good. In our times, maybe a fourth grader maths is equivalent to your 10th grader maths. Today, I keep wondering, when everything is evolving, everything is getting more and more complicated. How is it that this thing could, you know, be deteriorating? No, you tend to see things like, the society, today's society is bad, today's music is bad, today's food is bad. It could be, but again, from what kind of standpoint you are looking at it. And if at all you are looking at it, it is your duty as a sociologist to have that kind of a detached feeling towards that, without being engaged with that kind of a bias because it belongs to you, because you also have the same kind of problem. As Weber said that normally we pick up our issues and problems based on the experience that we have. No problem, no doubt in that. Definitely something that affects us, it will be close to our heart. But the thing is that how you deal with that problem as a sociologist, that idea of that methodology as to how you should think sociologically, that comes from C. Wright Mills. So basically, he is reminding you, to take a stance for a kind of a study where you need to put everything in a context. Even if it's a cup of coffee, you are contextualizing that cup of coffee. So what is that context? That context is a restaurant, that context is a factory, that context is the kitchen where we are talking about inequality of gender relations. The context is a bigger trade relationship between nations, what that context is. So even if you are reading a book, remember he says that every book has to be read as, because when you are reading a book, you are having a dialogue with an author, perhaps who doesn't exist anymore, or who lived 200 years ago. So basically, when you grasp those ideas, when you are thinking of or reading these thinkers, so called classical thinkers like Comte or Karl Marx or Weber or Durkheim, try to put yourself within that context to understand them. That when was the time when Marx or Comte was talking about it? Comte came up with this idea when he was almost fed up with this French Revolution, with in its milieu. So, in everything that you do, in every piece of research or any piece of book you are reading, you have to take into account the context. That's one of the important things that C. Wright Mills is talking about. So, methodologically speaking, that is how sociological imagination is all about. Thinking yourselves away from the routine milieu, grasping history and biography together, because there is a relationship between history and biography. Because biography, if it is the narrative, history gives you the context. And as I told you, we have a sense of a historical force acting on us. And thirdly, the idea of personal milieu and public issues as a part of the social structure. Then the idea of a survey cannot be just reduced to headless people. You have to take a notion of who are you talking to, what their background is about. Again, we are talking about the context, from what context this kind of a notion has emerged. So this is important when we talk about these things. The other important thing that you need to talk about as a sociologist is the idea of common sense. What is common sense? What is your idea about common sense? There are so many stories and fables on common sense, isn't it? That common sense is not very common. Common sense is so very important in your everyday life. One thing that you need to remember is that, you know, common sense is something which can be detrimental to your scientific mind as a researcher. Common sense has its purposes and its roles. We'll discuss it when we'll be talking about, constructing hypothesis and all. But as a beginner, common sense should be kept at bay, because you know the idea of common sense is that you know it's self-explanatory. People would say, don't you have this much of common sense? ଏତିକି ଜାଣିନ ତମେ ଏଇ ଯୋଉ ଜିନିଷଟା। So common sense is self-explanatory. You don't have to justify it. You don't have to, prove it. You don't have to conduct any experiment to prove common sense, because common sense has that legitimacy, that hegemonic role idea in the society. कि it is common sense. You don't have to prove it. The most important part of common sense is that you don't have to go on proving it. So, sociology as a discipline is concerned with developing certain systematic reliable knowledge about human relationships. And when we develop this kind of a discourse, this kind of a reliable knowledge, we tend to replace common sense with science, the science that you have created as a sociologist. If you call something a common sense, as I told you, you really do not know it is true or false, but you do not have to prove it. That's the most important part in common sense. You don't have to prove it. It is assumed to be proved by experience, because it is such an age old thing. Your grandmother has been talking about it. Your forefathers have been talking about it. These has been passed on to you in the form of stories, in the form of proverbs. So common sense is always there. So anything can pass off as common sense. You cannot, you don't need to prove it. it has already been proven. So common sense is something which is very strong, and which actually need not be proved. And basically, when I say how do you define a common sense, now common sense could be a guess, a collective guess, and it could be a hunch. No, common sense, my common sense says that this has to be this. You know, you are just, trying to guess something, and it is a kind of a half-hearted trial error learning. Yeah, in that situation, this thing happened. Normally, I was in that kind of a situation earlier, and this thing happened. This will also get repeated. Not necessarily. Maybe the previous situation that you are talking about, the time was different, the context was different, or the problem might be similar, but the way it was handled, the factors affecting that problem, it was different. You have not taken all those things into consideration while you talked about that as common sense. So basically, I am trying to have this conclusion that common sense are based on ignorance, prejudice, and certain mistaken interpretations which we feel that we do not need to prove it. Just a moment. Okay, so common sense preserves both folk wisdom and folk nonsense also. No doubt it preserves some wisdom because it gives you a sense of a practical knowledge. Something is practical when you are talking about common sense. But at the same time, we might be passed on with certain kind of folk nonsense which we have been accumulating, the accumulated ignorance that has been handed over to us for generations to come. That is also possible through common sense. So social science as a discipline forms part of everybody's experience, and it appears so close to common sense. I don't know, you might have you know experienced this. People tend to believe that sociology as a discipline is about family and marriage, isn't it? Sociology रे पढ़िबार किछि नाही. You don't have to read anything. You, whatever you see around yourself, you just need to write essays on it. And that's the reason so many people take it as an optional in UPSC. They think that they don't have to read anything. It is such an easy subject that whatever they see around, they can write. Why? Because there is a thin dividing line between commonsensical knowledge and sociological knowledge. It is not always true that commonsensical knowledge is false or you have to get rid of commonsensical knowledge. You know, a co-passenger who would be traveling with you, he will also have some kind of social analysis of the situation that you would be having as a sociologist. So what makes you different from a commoner? We all have the right to make an analysis of our lives, isn't it? Doctors always keep complaining that why patients read, they try to become a Google doctor. And definitely it is my body. I will try to, have some knowledge about my body and how you are looking into my body, what kind of medicines you are administering in my body. I have the right to know about my body. So I will take the help of Google. Similarly, every person located in a particular situation will have the right to know about his or her surrounding. They will try to analyze it. You cannot say that it is the sole prerogative of a sociologist to analyze the event or the surrounding happening around him or her. But If that is the case, you have to answer me how you are different from a commoner, because common sense can answer everything. Why do you need to study sociology? Tell me. Is it important now to study sociology? ଆଖପାଖରେ ଯାହାକୁ ଦେଖିବ, they will have some kind of an analysis, so some kind of an analysis of their situation, of the world around them, of what is happening around them. They will try to give an analysis. So people will think that okay, you're doing sociology. What is the reason? Why do you need to do sociology? Even a person without a degree can analyze that, can come up with those kind of sociological interpretation. What is, what different you are doing? How it is a training for you? So people will undermine you definitely, because you have taken sociology as a discipline, as a subject. So somebody who is doing physics or somebody who is doing economics, they will think that they are doing something serious, because a lay person cannot come up with the analysis they can come up with. But when it comes to your discipline, anybody can come up with certain analysis. So what makes you special? Or is your discipline just, a misnomer? It has no relevance. Is it so? What do you think? Okay, we will continue with this discussion tomorrow, but I want you to think of this answer. How your discipline is different from the, your understanding of your discipline, their understanding of the world around you, your interpretation is different from a common man's analysis of the situation. Else, we don't need a discipline like this if everybody can do it, isn't it? Please think of an answer tomorrow. We will take up this discussion from here itself. Once you come up with certain kind of what you say, introspections or interpretation of this particular discourse. Any queries, any doubts in today's lecture? You can shoot your questions. Anything you missed out upon, or anything that requires more clarity, you can tell me now. No? So we can just put an end to today's class. Okay, stop sharing the screen. So we will meet tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. and we will take the discussion further. But before that, I would first like to have a discussion with you as per the question that I have addressed. I want you to address it and give your own interpretation as to how your interpretation of the world around you would be different from a common man's take. Okay. Thank you. We'll meet tomorrow.